Alright, this is the Cold War. We're actually going to be in the Cold War for the rest of the semester. So really this chapter, if I could rename it, which I'm taking the name from the old textbook, but if I could rename it, I would call it like the Cold War of the 50s or something like that, because the Cold War happens, as Vietnam is happening, as the Civil Rights Movement is happening, as the Korean War is happening. So we're going to be in it for a long time, but that's kind of what this chapter is, the Cold War of the 50s. This first section that we're going to go through is actually a section that I've moved. It really belongs originally with the old World War II section, but I think it really goes better here, kind of sets you up for what we're going to be talking about in the Cold War. So we'll call this section 1. I know it says section 5 on here because I've taken it from a different chapter. Call this section 1, and we'll just roll right through it. So this is the effects of World War II, the beginning of the Cold War. All right. At Yalta, that's where we're going to start. Unlike World War I, World War II was fought until the very end of the war, meaning we had to kind of slug it out in every single country, every single city, every single island when we're talking about the Pacific, with the Axis powers of Germany and Japan fighting long after they knew they were never going to win the war. Germany only surrendered after Hitler had committed suicide, and Japan surrendered after the United States had dropped 2 atomic bombs. The protracted fighting gave the Allies some time, though, to make plans for what they were going to do in a post-war world. If you don't remember, when we went over the end of World War I and the meetings at the Palace of Versailles, it was a mess. It was not something that we handled super well, and it's part of the reason that World War II happened. So going into this post-war talks, we want to do a better job to try to prevent another global outbreak of war. That was the goal. So in February of 1945, FDR, Churchill, and Stalin, the original Big Three, meet at Yalta to discuss the final strategy for Germany and how they were going to handle the territory after the war was over. They agreed that Romania, Poland, and Bulgaria were going to hold free elections after the war, and Stalin is going to break that promise later on. He made a lot of promises that he never intended to keep towards the end of World War II, because he's looking now at expanding the Soviet Union's empire, not just beating Germany and ending the war, but getting territory for himself. In July of 1945, a different Big Three, so Truman stepping in for Roosevelt. He had passed away in April. This is July. Clement Attlee had been replaced, was there. He replaced Churchill. Churchill had actually lost an election, surprisingly. He does end up becoming the prime minister again later after the war, but to end the actual war, it's Clement Attlee that's the prime minister for Great Britain. And they meet in Berlin, or a suburb of Berlin, Potsdam. Truman learns while he's at this meeting at Potsdam that we have the capability now to drop an atomic bomb. They agree at Potsdam to split Germany and Berlin into zones of occupation. This would later on become East and West Germany and East and West Berlin. I've got a picture of it right here on this slide for you. So there's the Big Three at Yalta, and then on the other side of the slide is the Big Three at Potsdam. And in the middle, that's the map I'm referring to. So it's 4 colors. It can kind of look confusing, and I'll show you what the countries kind of ended up looking at like on the next slide. But I wanted you to see the original zones of occupation, and I wanted you to see where Berlin, the capital city, is. It's in what becomes East Germany, but because it's the capital city, the other 2 of the Big Three, Stalin obviously didn't agree with this, they wanted to make sure the capital city mirrored Germany overall. So they end up splitting the city in half, and eventually there's going to be something called the Berlin Wall put up that will divide that city in half and kind of surround the city so that people that live in East Berlin can't switch over to West Berlin and move to a capitalist economy. Alright, some other changes. So you can see on the map what East and West Berlin look like. And that black line is what becomes known as the Iron Curtain, which we'll talk about later on. World War II greatly altered the political realities of the world. In terms of geography and leadership, strong differences led to the division of Germany even further. West and East, we talked about. So East Germany is going to become a communist country. West Germany is non-communist. Nearly all the countries east of Germany became communist after World War II. So on that side, the eastern side of that black line on the map there, all become communist or very heavily communist influence, if we don't want to call them, communist per se. A long-standing civil war in China, which had been going on before World War II started, and then when Japan invaded China at the early stages of World War II, they kind of hit pause. Now that World War II is over, that civil war starts back up again, and the two sides are nationalism versus communism. And just a little spoiler alert, the communist side wins, and it becomes the People's Republic of China, but we'll talk about that later too. In Japan, General Douglas MacArthur headed an American military occupation and the writing of a new constitution, and we stayed in Japan while they did that. They abolished armed forces except for defense, gave women the right to vote, and enacted democratic reforms, kind of helped Japan redo their government before we would leave that country, which was pretty normal for a military to do after a war in certain countries. The war also marked the end of Western European domination of the world. Britain, France, and Spain had exerted influence over the world since the 1500s. And I know it's maybe been a while since you've thought about world history, but that's where you guys talked about this stuff and colonizing and being in Africa and all other places. India was a place that they had calling the United States, if you want to go back to your early American history classes, right? That age of imperialism is really over after World War II ends, and there's pressure put on these old empires and these old monarchies, like Great Britain, for example. It's a version of a monarchy, to change and give their influence up for people all over the world. And that does begin to happen. After World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union were the two true superpowers in the world. They played the most active role in the victories in Europe and the Pacific, and they were the most solid standing countries economically, militarily, just in terms of infrastructure going forward. The United States was stronger of the two because really the war hadn't been fought on American soil at all. Yes, we've been hit at Pearl Harbor, but as far as overall damage in the war, we were pretty fine. Additionally, the United States industry had boomed during the war. It actually helped us get out of the Great Depression, and then our economy through the 50s is only going to get better. In contrast, a lot of the war had been fought in the Soviet Union, and they were still kind of transitioning and trying to figure out how to become, kind of get their gears fully in motion of being a communist country. After meeting with the Allies at Bretton Woods in New Hampshire in 1944, the United States pushed for the creation of something called the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. They also signed something called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade in 1948 that was designed to expand world trade and reducing tariffs. Perhaps most importantly for post-World War II development, though, and the biggest correction, I guess you could say, a lesson that we learned after World War I was getting rid of whatever we're going to call the League of Nations. It was basically a failure, and replacing it with something called the United Nations, or the UN. This is still around today. It has been incredibly successful in comparison to the shortfallings of the League of Nations. In April of 1945, 50 delegates from 50 different countries met in San Francisco to write the UN Charter. The Senate ratified the Charter, and the UN set up its permanent home in New York City. So if you visit New York City, you can go and see the UN headquarters there. The UN is organized on the basis of cooperation of the great powers, who were given permanent seats on the Security Council, and it was not based on absolute equality between nations, because that was one of the issues of the League of Nations, is the United States wasn't even a part of it. We helped create it. So this was definitely a correction of some of the mistakes we made with the League of Nations. Permanent members of the Security Council are the United States, China, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and France. Alright. During World War II, the Axis powers had repeatedly violated the Geneva Convention, which is an international agreement governing the humane treatment of wounded soldiers and POWs. I don't think I need to go over all the ways that they broke that, because we talked about that in World War II and the horrible treatment that some of these guys endured in the Pacific and in Germany as well. I probably talked about it more when we were talking about the Pacific, and we looked at more examples from that, but it happened with the Germans as well. The Allies tried more than 1,000 Japanese for committing atrocities in China, Korea, and Southeast Asia, not to mention their brutal treatment of POWs. Hundreds, if you don't remember, were condemned to death, including Hideki Tojo, and the general responsible for the Bataan Death March. In the Nuremberg Trials, the Allies prosecuted the Nazis for their war crimes and turned a glaring spotlight on the evil acts committed by the Third Reich, especially an emphasis on the crimes they committed with the Holocaust. They wanted to make sure that they did this right, and we'll watch some video on that to make sure that you really get a sense of how heavily they wanted to document these trials, because they didn't want Holocaust deniers to be able to say, well, that didn't really happen, well, you're making it work. No, it happened. They documented it. They brought tons of proof with them into court. A lot of Nazis attempted to escape going to trial, either by kind of following Hitler's example and committing suicide, or trying to leave the country. Some claimed that they were not fit to stand trial, that they lost their minds. But the trials did happen. We'll watch some stuff about those. During World War II, the constant reporting on the war effort led Americans to think in more global terms. This is going to be an end to our attempts, if you don't remember us talking about in previous chapters, to remain kind of isolated. We are a very big country and a very powerful country, and we're all alone, kind of, it seems like, in the Western Hemisphere, where all the other issues, it seems like, we always get ourselves involved in, or before this, had absolutely avoided getting involved in. We're in the Eastern Hemisphere, so we can kind of avoid it. After this happens and we join the UN and all these things, it becomes clear that we can no longer become an isolationist kind of country. World War II gave renewed vigor for many in the fight for civil rights. That'll be one of the next things we talk about, starting in the end of January. And we already talked about the economy, doing really well, helping in the Great Depression with World War II, and then how good the economy was in the 50s. That's something we'll talk about in a later chapter as well, in a little bit more detail. But that is the end of this section, Section 1, if you will, or sort of Section 5, but really the beginning of the Cold War. At least that's how I'm going to teach it for this class, so make sure that you watch the videos that go along with this. They'll be posted along with this, and make sure you go through your notes for this and follow the quizzes and whatever else I've assigned to you, and we will continue with the Cold War in the 50s in our next section.